The United States finds itself in a position it hasn't occupied in decades, one where its ability to unilaterally enforce economic sanctions is being openly challenged, not through diplomatic channels or international forums, but through direct military and economic retaliation. What we're witnessing isn't simply a tanker dispute in international waters or another round of sanctions and counter-sanctions. This represents something far more significant: the emergence of a coordinated resistance to American economic coercion, led by two nations that have spent years preparing for exactly this moment. Russia and Venezuela, both targets of sustained U.S. sanctions regimes, have now moved beyond defensive posturing. They're implementing concrete countermeasures that directly threaten the mechanisms Washington has relied upon to project power without deploying troops. The Trump administration's renewed aggression against Venezuelan oil exports has triggered a response that exposes a fundamental vulnerability in the American strategy: the assumption that targeted nations would simply absorb economic punishment indefinitely. That assumption is collapsing. The tanker incidents we're seeing represent the physical manifestation of a deeper geopolitical realignment, one where the rules governing global trade and energy markets are being rewritten in real time, not in conference rooms, but on the open sea. Let's understand what's actually happening here, because the corporate media and the political establishment want you to believe this is about rogue nations behaving badly, about dictators defying international law, about the necessity of American leadership maintaining order in a chaotic world. But that narrative, as compelling as it might sound to those who benefit from it, collapses the moment you examine the actual sequence of events, the actual economic relationships at play, and the actual history of how we arrived at this particular moment of crisis. The United States has been waging economic warfare against Venezuela for years now, and let's be very clear about what economic warfare means. It doesn't mean stern diplomatic letters or symbolic gestures. It means deliberately trying to collapse a nation's economy, to immiserate its population, to create conditions so desperate that either the government falls or the country becomes so weakened it can no longer resist American diktat. The sanctions regime imposed on Venezuela has been comprehensive, targeting not just government officials, but the entire oil industry that represents the backbone of the Venezuelan economy. And these sanctions don't just affect Venezuela in isolation. They ripple outward, affecting every nation, every company, every financial institution that might want to trade with Venezuela. The United States has effectively declared that its laws, its preferences, its geopolitical objectives take precedence over everyone else's sovereignty, everyone else's economic interests, everyone else's right to engage in normal commercial relations. Now, Russia has been living under a similar sanctions regime, one that has intensified dramatically since 2014 and then again after the conflict in Ukraine began. These sanctions were supposed to cripple the Russian economy, force Moscow to capitulate to Western demands, demonstrate the overwhelming power of American financial dominance. Except that's not what happened. Russia didn't collapse. Instead, Russia adapted. It began building alternative payment systems, strengthening economic ties with China, India, and other nations willing to trade outside the dollar system, developing domestic industries to replace imports, and most importantly, coordinating with other sanctioned nations to create networks of mutual support that bypass American financial infrastructure entirely. Venezuela and Russia, both sitting on massive energy reserves, both targeted by sustained American economic aggression, both governed by leaders Washington has demonized and sought to remove, have found common cause. This isn't ideological romance. This is hard-headed strategic calculation. They've recognized that the United States operates according to a particular logic: isolate your enemies one by one, cut them off from global markets, use the dominance of the dollar and American financial institutions to enforce compliance, and wait for internal collapse. The counter-strategy, then, becomes obvious. Don't let yourself be isolated. Build alternative networks. Support each other economically and, when necessary, militarily. Make the cost of American aggression higher than Washington is willing to pay. The tanker war, as it's being called, represents the physical manifestation of this strategy. The Trump administration has ramped up efforts to interdict Venezuelan oil shipments, to track tankers carrying Venezuelan crude, to threaten sanctions against any entity involved in transporting, refining, or purchasing this oil. This goes beyond traditional sanctions. This is active interference with commercial shipping, with the flow of energy resources that nations need to function. And here's where it gets interesting, because Russia has now committed naval assets to escort Venezuelan tankers, to provide protection against American interdiction efforts, to make it clear that any attempt to seize or disable these vessels will be met with a military response. Think about what this means in practical terms. American naval forces, accustomed to operating with impunity in international waters, now face situations where stopping a tanker carrying Venezuelan oil means potentially engaging with Russian military vessels providing escort. The calculations change completely. What was previously a low-risk operation, boarding a tanker, inspecting its cargo, perhaps diverting it to a friendly port, now becomes a potential trigger for direct military confrontation between nuclear powers. This is how wars that nobody actually wants nevertheless begin. This is how a series of escalatory steps, each one seeming reasonable or necessary from the perspective of the actors involved, leads to catastrophic outcomes. But we need to go deeper than just the immediate military dynamics, because this tanker war is really about something much larger. It's about the architecture of global power that the United States constructed after World War II and has maintained, with varying degrees of success, ever since. That architecture rests on several pillars. First, military dominance, the ability to project force anywhere in the world, to maintain bases on every continent, to ensure that no coalition of powers can challenge American military superiority. Second, financial dominance, the role of the dollar as the world's reserve currency, the centrality of American banks and financial institutions in global transactions, the ability to essentially print money and have the rest of the world accept it as valuable. Third, technological dominance, leadership in innovation, control over critical technologies, the ability to set standards that everyone else must follow. And fourth, ideological dominance, the claim that American-style capitalism and liberal democracy represent the natural endpoint of human political evolution, that there is no alternative system worthy of consideration. Every one of these pillars is now under stress in ways that would have seemed impossible 20 or 30 years ago. The military dominance is being challenged by the development of sophisticated weapons systems by Russia and China that can deny American forces access to entire regions. The financial dominance is being eroded by the creation of alternative payment systems, by the increasing use of currencies other than the dollar for international trade, by the recognition that weaponizing the financial system for political purposes makes everyone else want to find alternatives. The technological dominance is being contested by rapid advances in China, by the diffusion of technological capabilities across multiple centers of innovation, by the realization that the United States can no longer simply assume it will lead in every critical sector. And the ideological dominance has been shattered by the multiple failures of American foreign policy, by the visible dysfunction of American domestic politics, by the growing awareness around the world that perhaps the American model isn't actually the universal solution it was advertised to be. The tanker war crystallizes all of these tensions. It's a moment where American claims to be able to enforce its will unilaterally run into the physical reality that other major powers are prepared to resist, and that resistance carries risks that Washington may not be willing to accept. Because here's the thing about the American empire that doesn't get discussed enough in polite company. It's fundamentally an economic empire, not a territorial one. The United States doesn't need to occupy countries to dominate them. It controls them through debt, through trade relationships, through the threat of being cut off from dollar-denominated markets, through the promise of investment and the threat of its withdrawal. This is a much more efficient form of empire than the old colonial model, but it has a critical vulnerability. It only works as long as the targets of this system believe they have no alternative. What Russia and Venezuela are demonstrating in the most direct way possible is that alternatives exist. Yes, those alternatives come with costs. Yes, life under sanctions is harder than life integrated into the American-led economic system. But those costs can be borne, especially when the alternative is complete subjugation to American political demands. And once some nations demonstrate that resistance is possible, that you can survive outside the American sphere, and even thrive in some respects, the entire logic of the system starts to break down. Other countries start calculating differently. Do we really need to follow Washington's lead on this issue? What would actually happen if we pursued our own interests? Can we rely on the United States to act as a fair arbiter, or is American power primarily exercised for American benefit? The Trump administration's approach has been to double down on coercion, to assume that if you just apply enough pressure, if you make the pain intense enough, eventually your targets will break. But this strategy has a fundamental flaw, one that any student of history should recognize. People and nations don't always behave rationally in the face of coercion. Sometimes they resist, even when resistance seems futile. Sometimes they endure incredible hardship rather than submit. Sometimes the very act of applying pressure creates a determination to resist that wouldn't have existed otherwise. You can see this dynamic playing out right now in Venezuela, where years of sanctions have indeed caused enormous economic suffering but haven't produced the political outcome Washington desired. You can see it in Russia, where sanctions have actually increased public support for the government by creating a sense of national solidarity against external aggression. And now we're seeing the next phase, where resistance moves from passive endurance to active countermeasures. The decision to provide military escorts for Venezuelan tankers isn't just symbolic, it's operational. It changes the calculations for American naval commanders who now have to weigh the strategic importance of interdicting a single shipment of oil against the risk of triggering a much larger confrontation. It demonstrates to other nations watching this confrontation that American power, while still formidable, isn't absolute, that there are ways to push back, that Washington's threats don't always materialize into action. This is incredibly dangerous, and we should be clear-eyed about that. Wars often begin not because anyone actually wants them, but because the logic of escalation takes over, because leaders feel they can't back down without appearing weak, because miscalculation or accident triggers a response that spirals out of control. The tanker war creates multiple opportunities for exactly this kind of escalation. A nervous crew on an American destroyer fires on what it perceives as a threat. A Russian escort vessel interprets an American maneuver as aggressive and responds in kind. An accident in close quarters leads to casualties that demand a response. Any of these scenarios, and dozens of others we could imagine, could be the spark that ignites a much larger conflagration. But here's what makes this situation so intractable. From the American perspective, backing down now means accepting that its sanctions regime can be openly defied, that its attempts to control global energy markets can be resisted, that its claims to enforce international norms are empty when challenged by capable adversaries. That's an enormous blow to American prestige and to the credibility of American power. Every other nation facing American pressure would immediately recognize that if Russia and Venezuela can successfully resist, maybe they can too. The entire structure of American geopolitical dominance depends on the belief that resistance is futile, that eventually Washington will get its way. Once that belief erodes, the empire starts to crumble. From the Russian and Venezuelan perspective, backing down now means accepting permanent subjugation to American economic warfare, means acknowledging that they have no right to engage in normal commercial relations without Washington's permission, means condemning their populations to indefinite economic suffering for the crime of not subordinating their foreign policies to American preferences. That's also an impossible pill to swallow for governments that derive much of their legitimacy from promising national sovereignty and resistance to external domination. So we have a classic situation where both sides feel they cannot afford to back down, where the costs of escalation seem lower than the costs of capitulation, where the incentives all point toward continued confrontation despite the catastrophic risks involved. This is how the First World War started, remember. Not because any of the major powers actually wanted a continent-wide conflagration, but because a series of commitments and calculations made escalation seem preferable to backing down at each step of the crisis. The global economy is already feeling the effects of this confrontation. Energy markets are nervous about the security of supply routes. Insurance rates for tankers in affected areas have skyrocketed. Nations dependent on Venezuelan or Russian oil are scrambling to secure alternative supplies or to find ways to continue existing trade relationships without triggering American sanctions. The uncertainty itself is damaging, even before any actual military confrontation occurs, because modern economies require predictability, require the confidence that goods ordered will be delivered, that payments made will be honored, that the basic infrastructure of international commerce will continue to function. And here's something that should worry everyone paying attention. The United States increasingly finds itself isolated in its maximum pressure campaign. European allies have been reluctant partners in sanctions against Russia and Venezuela, often complying only under pressure and looking for ways to maintain economic relationships where possible. China and India have continued to buy Russian energy despite American objections. Much of the global South views American sanctions as illegal, unilateral, coercive measures that violate the sovereignty of targeted nations. The moral authority that the United States once claimed, the ability to rally an international coalition around shared principles, has been significantly eroded by years of inconsistent application of those principles, by the visible hypocrisy of condemning others for actions America itself engages in, by the growing perception that American leadership primarily serves American interests rather than any broader conception of global welfare. This is the context in which the tanker war is unfolding, not simply as a bilateral dispute between the United States and two countries it considers adversaries, but as a manifestation of a much larger struggle over what kind of world order will prevail in the 21st century. Will it remain a unipolar order where American preferences essentially become international law, where the threat of economic isolation is enough to ensure compliance, where military dominance underwrites economic hegemony? Or are we transitioning to a multipolar order where several major powers maintain their own spheres of influence, where alternative economic systems compete with the dollar-based system, where the costs of enforcing hegemony become too high for any single power to bear? The outcome of this struggle matters enormously, not just for geopolitics, but for ordinary people everywhere who will live with the consequences. A world lurching toward major power confrontation is a world where resources get diverted from human needs toward military competition, where economic development gets disrupted by sanctions and trade wars, where the risk of catastrophic conflict hangs over every international dispute. But a world where the United States successfully maintains absolute dominance is also problematic, because history shows us that unchecked power inevitably gets abused, that empire always privileges the interests of the imperial center over the periphery, that the benefits of economic integration flow disproportionately to those who control the system. What we need, what the world desperately needs but seems increasingly unlikely to get, is a negotiated transition to a more equitable international order, one where the legitimate security interests of all major powers are respected, where economic relationships are based on mutual benefit rather than coercion, where international law applies equally to strong and weak nations alike. But achieving that would require the United States to voluntarily relinquish some of its privileges to accept constraints on its power in exchange for a more stable and legitimate global system, and it would require Russia, China, and other rising powers to exercise restraint in challenging American dominance, to resist the temptation to simply replace one hegemonic system with another. The tanker war suggests we're not heading in that direction. Instead, we're seeing escalation, confrontation, the logic of power politics unrestrained by any broader vision of global cooperation. And that should frighten all of us, because the weapon systems involved in these confrontations, the potential for miscalculation and accident, the historical precedents of how these dynamics play out, all point toward outcomes that would be catastrophic, not just for the nations directly involved, but for the entire interconnected global system that 7 billion people depend on for their survival and welfare.